Oh, over there. Hello, Internet. My name's Ben Hammersley. I'm the editor-at-large of Wired magazine. We're here to talk about cyber warfare, and I'm not going to do very much speaking, thankfully. I do have, however, 4 exceptionally lovely and very clever guests who are going to be having a bit of a conversation. The format for this evening is we're going to have a bit of a talk amongst ourselves, really. You can listen in for about the first 25 minutes, and then we're going to go out to you guys to ask questions, to make your own points. And I will be reiterating the point again about having your phones off, saying your name to the microphone, not making speeches, all that sort of stuff. Those of you who've been to the Frontline Club before, welcome back. Those of you who've never been here before, thank you for coming. It is an exceptionally fine venue. There is great stuff on every night. But enough about that. What about today? From your left, we have Rex Hughes, who's a visiting fellow in cybersecurity at Wolfson College, Cambridge. Next to me, Claire York from Chatham House, manager of the International Security Programme. Peter Summer, visiting professor at the LSE. And perhaps the most influential and respected person in this field. And Carl Leonard, senior security research manager from WebSense, representing the industry. I'm going to ask all of them to say a few words, and then we'll get down to the arguing. Rex.
All right. Is this on here?
Yes.
So, cyber security, broadly as defined, depending on your perspective, really could be just about anything. And I think why you're here is interested is what this means in terms of your lives, and what the government is trying to do about it, what industry is trying to do about it, and what research is saying about it. And I just came back from a trip in Washington, D.C., where many agencies and units in the U.S. government are trying to do something about it, but it's not altogether clear if they're succeeding in the efforts to either deter attacks in cyberspace or create deterrence, and both from a law enforcement and military perspective, than what the private sector is doing as well. So it's a very complex topic. There's a lot of good research being published. I know Dr. Summers has a very worthy OECD study out, and Chatham House as well has published quite interesting reports on this topic. But tonight I'm here really to learn from this audience as well is how, especially people in media, in the activist community, how you see the debate unfolding, and if it's a healthy one, or even if the concepts are understood correctly. At Cambridge, we do work both in the technical realm and then in the more arts and society policy realm. And my research bridges both. I have a IT computer science background as well as an international relations background. So we just convened a workshop last week where I believe your co-author, Ian Brown, was there, and we looked at the topic from a variety of perspectives, and we figured there's not just one elephant room, there are many. And even 10 years on in the field, it's very difficult to come up with common definitions and concepts that really make sense. But a lot of money is about to be spent on this topic. The Prime Minister here has committed at least £1 billion towards securing cyberspace, and there's still a lot to come about that type of response. So again, this will be interesting to see. I think ultimately, we as society, we want an internet that's both open and secure in 2 very different poles, and how we reconcile that is a very steep challenge indeed.
Fantastic. Claire York.
Good evening. I'm from Chatham House, and at Chatham House we look at cybersecurity from very much of a policy strategy level. We will readily admit we are not technologists at Chatham House, but what we want to look at is how does cybersecurity fit within the broader debate. So we've been looking at cybersecurity as it relates to critical national infrastructures, so identifying vulnerabilities and dependencies in our critical national infrastructure. Where are we exposed? What does this mean? And what are the implications for broader society? And we also look at cyber warfare. And within our cyber warfare work, we recently published a report called On Cyber Warfare, and the reference to Clausewitz was intentional. But in that, what we argued is that cyberspace needs to be guided far more by policy. It needs to be constrained more by politics. We need to be inserting values and norms into it so that we can start to understand it. And I know from my own experience within this field that currently it remains too much of a virtual thing. We see cyber as something very remote. It's something separate, and what we've got to do is look at how we make it more real, and that means not only for policymakers but also for the general public, because people in London, people in the field know a lot about this topic already. They're aware of the emerging ideas, They're aware of the different debates and the anecdotes of where people have hacked and where people have managed to achieve some kind of strategic effect. But what the public don't realise is what it means in their everyday life, and how warfare within cyberspace is actually far more about merging the battlefield with society as a whole. It's about creating a whole new entity, but one that is maybe not that dissimilar from what we already know. So that's what our work is looking at. And in addition to that, we do look at financial crime and the cyber implications. And that's something that's come out very strongly from government recently, is that cyber poses a genuine threat to economic security, both nationally and internationally, with the amounts lost every year. And I believe it's something like a penny for every pound is believed to have been lost in cybercrime. And we really need to be looking at what this means for our overall security, not just in the sense of warfare, but in the sense of national prosperity and national well-being.
Peter.
Right. One of the big problems in this area we've already heard from the first two speakers, which is trying to define what the subject matter is. There is a temptation, I think, for anyone who wants to talk about the subject to try and bring more and more issues into it and thereby make themselves a more interesting person to talk to, and if they are academics or think tanks, to try and acquire research funding. I think one has to be sort of perfectly honest about it. The Chatham House study is deliberately called cyber warfare, not cyber war, because they are bright enough to know that if it's going to be cyber war, then it has to look something like a real war with people dying. And one of the characteristics of the things that we've seen so far is that people don't die, and most of the time property isn't damaged. All what happens is that various things get disturbed, but maybe people lose money. By using the phrase cyber warfare, Chatham House have been able to bring in a whole range of additional things. They talk a little bit, I think, about industrial espionage. I'm not quite sure whether they do it, but other people who have tried the same trick also try to bring in propaganda and psychological operations of one sort or another. Those of you who saw Newsnight last week, the chap I was sort of having a discussion with across the Atlantic uses the phrase information operations, and his particular shtick to try and sort of make the subject even broader is that the way in which nations in the future are going to improve their position in the world is by concentrating on the information dimension. The problem with this sort of approach, though, is that as the subject gets broader and broader, it becomes more and more difficult to have a sensible discussion. And what we tried to do in our OECD study was to identify the different sectors that one might talk about. And one of the other things that I want to try and get across to you this evening is that in many senses you can get too hung up on the concept of cyber and forget that what cyber offers is a new dimension on things that have been around for a very, very long time. So if you're talking about fraud, as Chatham House was just now, fraud's been around for a very, very long time indeed. If we look at the various types of activity that people have got excited about, you'll see that it's actually got a long, long history, and all that has happened is that the cyber dimension has given it an added element. So in recent weeks, people have been looking at the activities of hacktivists like Anonymous, and they've labelled it cyber war, exclamation mark. It seems to me that that's probably not war in any sort of sense, that the way to understand what the hacktivists are doing is very similar to what Greenpeace and a large number of environmental groups have been trying to do. In other words, it's civil disobedience and trying with the agenda of trying to attract attention to a particular point of view. It doesn't take it any further than that. You've had the activities of traditional hackers being labelled as cyber warfare, but that really isn't cyber cyber warfare. Either it's people demonstrating their prowess. You have seen other things which are, if you like, the skirmishes that are a precursor to war. The equivalent of putting your army on manoeuvres, firing a rocket to show that you mean business, but actually you're not going to push it further. How many of these things do we actually call cyber war? We've had a mention of cyber crime. We have a similar sort of problem about how we categorize that. Do we say that the cyber element is the important element, or the fraud, or the extortion? So what I hope we're going to be exploring in the course of this evening is not only the impact that cyber has, but also all the other elements that are really quite old and traditional, the way they have got changed by the availability of cyber weapons and the way in which one can operate in cyberspace.
Great. Before we get on to that, our final panelist, Carl Leonard.
Good evening, everyone. So I am from a vendor in the security industry, as Ben has said. So my team of researchers protect our customers within the private sector and the government sector day in, day out. So we see the very real effects of targeted, coordinated attacks at our customers' infrastructures. Why is this happening? Because it's the information or data that these corporations have that individuals are trying to gain access to. Whether this is state-funded and can be attributed to, states flexing their muscles and seeing what potential actions they can do on another state or a particular organisation that would represent that country or state. It's unsure. Sure, there's lots of speculation, but we're certainly seeing an increase in the number of such attacks across different attack vectors, whether that would be simple social engineering, putting a spy, as it were, into the organisation and then trying to infiltrate that state or that government agency or that large corporation to try and bring down that organisation or get access to information. As again Peter's mentioned, this is an age-old technique that is used by generals during warfare. But what's changed now? It's absolutely the fact that the internet as a communication system is spreading extremely quickly globally. Massive pickup in China and India and the growing regions, emerging regions, and it's just because the internet makes everything so available. You can so easily create applications that can disrupt nuclear systems. For example, Stuxnet. Was that state funded? Not sure. There's lots of speculation about it, but it certainly shows the capabilities of malicious applications, the intentions of people to conduct this type of activity.
Do you think it's actually, sorry to interrupt you,
No
do you think Stuxnet was actually a particularly easy thing to do? Because for me, the significant thing about it was actually the amount of work that was required in order to make it the highly targeted thing it's supposed to have been.
Before you get into the answer, let's just remind the audience, those of you who don't know what Stuxnet was, it was and correct me if I get these details entirely wrong, but it was a virus which was specifically targeted at the command and control systems for the centrifuges which were enriching uranium within the Iranian uranium enrichment plants, which caused them both to spin out of control and come off their bearings and basically break, but also faked the readings on the dials so that the engineers in the enrichment plants didn't know this was happening. And it was an exceptionally specific payload to this particular virus.
Absolutely, it was extremely targeted towards that environment. It wasn't easy to do, but now the malware authors have created something like that. It shows that this was a precedent. They set a precedent. This can be done. So apology if I said if it was easy, it wouldn't have been easy. A lot of background research would have gone into it. The amount of zero-day code that was used in this attack was unheard of before. Zero-day code is code that can affect a vulnerable application, cause codes to be run, but nobody's got protection against it. They used 5 0 days in this attack. Normally an attack just uses 1. So this absolutely showed the work that went into conducting these attacks. So
but don't you think what it actually does is help us sort of assess what the risks are? I mean, obviously we've got a number of journalists here, and what the journalists want to know is give us tomorrow's scare story, please. But the lesson I took from it was that if you're actually having to advise a company or a government about risk, so these are the things you worry about, these are the things you don't have to worry quite so much about. And one of the things we kept on saying in our OECD report was the use of lurid language and the endless uncritical reuse of lurid anecdotes doesn't actually help make us any safer. So, I mean, in a way, the lesson I took from it was actually there aren't all that many people who can produce this type of attack, because it's not only writing the code, it is doing all the highly detailed research on the targets, and that means probably a relatively small number of nation states who are capable of doing it, and probably never going to be the case, say, that the lone hacker or even the small terrorist group is going to be able to do that. Now that helps us set the threshold of risk, it seems to me, and that's an important discipline that we need to do. Or maybe you're going to disagree with me violently.
No, absolutely not. This is a very infrequent occurrence. It was a very specialised attack. We don't all run nuclear power plants, so the risk to us is very low. If you look at frequency versus potential damage versus, are we likely to be affected by this? Most of us are not, but it just sets a precedence for the amount of efforts that people are willing to go to these days to disrupt operations and infrastructure.
But Rex, on the one hand, you have got these incredibly sophisticated 5 0-day exploit, information. I mean, that's undoubtedly been done by somebody with a lot of money and willpower and intelligence, and I'm sure we can all think of some countries who might fancy it.
A couple, too.
And also the lesson that I always pick from that is if you've got a uranium enrichment plant, don't connect it to the internet. I mean,
not during business.
But the vast majority of cyber warfare attacks that we see, the vast majority of these sorts of things it's more 4chan, right? It's more sort of denial of service attacks. It's kids messing around. It's not special forces taking down. It's not Bond plots. It's much more fluffy than that, isn't it? Isn't it 13-year-olds who've been upset because somebody's called out 4chan?
Yeah, I mean, I confess I used to be one of those geeks growing up in Seattle, and that's how you learn. And we should encourage some of the behavior not to attack Bashir plant and plants up north, but certainly it goes back to definitions and concepts and how warped the perspectives are in many cases, because cyber attack can mean just about anything. It could be recreational hacking, which again isn't always such a bad thing, although there's a lot of law enforcement like to criminalize everything, but that's not necessarily where society wants to go. And then all the way at the nation-state level, where covert activities, espionage, things that states do behind the black box. So we really need a much more debate and analysis and discussion, because again, we convened a workshop in Cambridge with cyber leadership in the UK, broadly from industry and government, academia, and some other NGOs, and it's really astonishing. Again, 10 years of this debate, and there's still many elephants in the room. So I think especially in the journalistic community, just really need to be cautious and challenge officials when they throw these things out there, because we see continuous replications of the mythology that always haven't been verified, and even some research have been guilty of that, of plots that really haven't been verified. So it's a very difficult sort of game in how you get that verification, because officials don't like to speak openly and confirm anything like that to years on. There was another attack like the Bashir incident in the early 80s, I believe it's in the Chatham House report, when Siberian pipeline was ostensibly attacked, that the U.S. sort of confessed to this, where they, during the Reagan administration, they put a payload inside of a SCADA controller that was delivered to a Russian gas plant in the north, and about 2 in the morning, a almost kiloton explosion went up in the air and was something that wasn't learned about years later. So it's probably not the first Stuxnet. There are probably many episodes like this, but again, your question about what's an attack, where does it fit in terms of society's sort of measure of it, and do we want to spend law enforcement, military resources, especially the weirdness of the private sector infrastructure, because historically it's been a long time since the military has gone out sort of privateering for industry to defend, and there are all sorts of interesting questions around that.
So Claire, taking this sort of down a notch, let's take it away from countries attacking countries and things like that. We have this, we talk about critical national infrastructure, but there are many critical national infrastructures, and there are critical personal infrastructures and critical company infrastructures. Everybody here would probably be jolly upset if their email went down for a day. After 3 days, they'd be losing it, to use the technical phrase. We're not really, when we talk about cyber warfare, we're not really talking about the baddies on the other side of the border who are attacking us. We're actually talking about a much more fluffy, sort of cloud-based, multi-vector thing that's happening all the time, aren't we? Just viruses taking down sites and people.
I'll refer to your comment earlier about our report. I would actually refrain from using this idea of war too often. I think it's
that's what you called your report.
It's true. It was called that to prompt the debate, because what we notice is that there's a huge amount of anecdotal discussion about cyber attacks, all of which are called cyber war. It's a new cyber war. Well, actually, it's just a rather bad hacking episode. And what we're trying to do is challenge what this cyber warfare is, because I think there's a tendency to prefix anything that we don't understand in cyberspace that happens in real life with cyber, whereas actually it might just be, like Peter said, a kind of cyber manifestation such as fraud or crime,
what we
which
did in our OECD report, we said, okay, you really want to use the word cyber war, then what cyber war has to mean, it's got to look something like what's going on in Afghanistan or what's going on in the Balkans, and if it's really going to be purely cyber, it's got to be exclusively attacks from computers onto computers, and on that basis you can say we haven't had any cyber wars, and we're probably not going to be having them at the moment. It almost doesn't make sort of sense. Even when they're used in the military circumstances, almost certainly the role of cyber weaponry, which is my personally preferred way of looking at it, look at the capabilities of cyber weapons and who is going to use them in particular circumstances. The main role is actually as a disruptor, or as the military sometimes talk about it, as a force multiplier. In other words, you're going to have a fairly conventional war, but you can magnify the effect by causing disruption of one sort or another in the electronic domain. Or if you are a terrorist, then I hesitate slightly to say this to an audience whose complete content I don't fully know, but if I were minded to mount a terrorist attack, I would combine a bomb with some sort of attack on a telephone or a radio system, which was sort of critical simply because it would cause additional confusion. I think that's much more the future than the pure cyber war. But by forcing people to say it's only cyber war if it's, as I said, computer to computer, and it looks like Afghanistan or whatever, I think you then push people into thinking much more about something less, but which is nevertheless very important to examine.
But I think there's something quite interesting about cyber war, because when I think of war in its traditional sense, you're thinking about what motivates it. So is it sovereignty, is it control, is it domination? And computer-computer warfare, what victory will you get from that? You can disrupt infrastructure, you can cause huge amount of disruption, whether through meaning no one gets online for 5 days, therefore no one knows what everyone's doing on Twitter, or actually bring down hospitals and infrastructure and pipelines. And it's that kind of understanding what we mean. And I think cyber warfare in the cyber domain is going to involve cyber as a weapon alongside conventional means if you're truly talking about warfare. But when you're talking about attacks, when you're talking about disruption, then that can come in many different forms, which I know both of our reports discuss.
Yes, you see what a badly chosen panel this is.
We're going to agree with you.
Because we're actually disagreeing rather.
I'm going to provoke them into a fight any minute now. Don't worry about it. Carl, this is all very well talking about nation state against nation state, or terrorist groups, or various Bond villains who want to come along and shut down hospitals. But you have clients who are continually under attack, whether it be overtly targeted at them or just general random the noise on the internet. Can you give us a sort of a flavour and perhaps some sort of figures about, and some examples, if you can, of the sort of thing that the average industrial client or public sector client that you have faces on that frontier?
Right. So within public sector, quite often they are party to lots of data, lots of confidential information that wouldn't want to go out into the public domain. So for whatever reason, whatever intentions, people see this gold mine of data within these organisations as something that they want to gain hold of. So some of the attacks that we see that are attempted on companies or organisations in the public sector are purely to just go after the data, whether that be to potentially manipulate that data, or whether to just then harvest that data and use it for a means that it wasn't intended for. If you can get hold of people's identities, you can then use that to register credit cards, you can then use that to register bank accounts, you can then transfer money into those bank accounts, and you can start withdrawing cash.
We can all, the Frontline Club membership are dodgy as anything, so we can all think of any form of criminal ways of using this sort of data, but can you give us some sort of idea of the extent of this sort of activity? I mean, if I was running an online retailer, for example, am I going to be under continuous assault from hundreds of groups, or is it once a week, or is it once a year? Is there, how many people are we talking about? How many baddies are there?
So first I'll touch on how frequently are these attacks. There's a term in the industry called APT, Advanced Persistent Threats. Now these advanced persistent threats are advanced because they're incredibly clever. They're persistent because they will just keep on hammering the organisation. If the organisation attempts to change or lock down in any way to stop the threat occurring, then the people perpetrating the attack will simply change their methods and continue to hammer the organisation. And of course they're a threat because they're going to succeed eventually, hopefully with the malrolls are thinking that these are going to succeed, and then the threat is to either your data, to your operations, to your reputation, any fines, any breach of compliance rules and regulations. So these advanced persistent threats just attempts to just keep on hammering the organisations. So that's something that a lot of government organisations, a lot of organisations in the finance sector are worried about. When I speak with people at events like this, they're the sort of things that are most concerning because they're the most difficult to defend against.
But again, I can understand why people would be worried about the concept of an advanced persistent threat, because it does sound quite scary. But are there any?
Yes. We have heard of organisations that are under these advanced persistent threats, but these are extremely targeted and very isolated. It might be in the government sector or military sector where there's real value to whatever information they might have behind their network gateways. When we think of it in terms of private sector and us as individuals, we're not going to be subject to an APT. Instead, we're going to be vulnerable just by browsing on the web, and we come across a malicious website that was perfectly legitimate yesterday, but has now been compromised in some way to host malicious code. So we could maybe consider ourselves to be under attack, when in fact we just happen to be the unlucky one who browsed this website at the time that the malicious code existed. Similarly to private organisations, when they have tens of thousands of internet users browsing to websites, there's going to be some code that just happens to be run in that environment, not particularly targeted towards that organisation, but the threat is still there, because those threats being deployed in a network can offer many things to the malware author or to the cyber criminal. He can open a backdoor into that machine, he can get access to the network, he can start pilfering data just off of the individual's machine who happens to be infected, or indeed he can then branch out into other parts of the company's network and start performing disruptive techniques. So there's, if you've got a big pot of data that's going to be considered gold to somebody who has malicious intentions, then obviously you're going to attribute a greater risk to that than to a bakery store who just happens to run a website and you do 50 transactions of selling bread per day. You're not really going to be wanting to spend on infrastructure, on security personnel, and on mitigation techniques, because the data that you've got isn't necessarily of great value. This is why governments are willing to spend £1 billion with private sector to implement security technologies, because there is and there are these persistent threats that are occurring. And 2010 for me was an absolute milestone, just because of the frequency of these attacks and just the precedence that it says that this is now in the public arena. We're now being made aware of these threats, and as it's been mentioned before on the panel, these threats have probably been happening for years, even far as back as the 80s, but the public just didn't know about it. Well, this is now in the public arena, hence why we're trying to have discussions and debates to try and influence the leaders of these organisations.
So you Rex, Carl had an interesting distinction there between nations, what could be considered to be nation-state attacks, and cyber criminals, I think was the phrase that you used, for commercial gain. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because it seems to me that you have, this isn't a clean battlefield, if you want to continue to use the warfare metaphor. You haven't just got other nation states, say the Chinese, for example, that I'm sure we'll come to talk about in a minute, but you do have organised crime and just kids doing things for fun. Can you talk a bit about that spread of actors there?
Sure. So there are really kind of four large domain of actors. Again, the nation state, organized crime, extremists, terrorists, and then I think the Chatham House report, script kiddies, the low feeders at the bottom. And where law enforcement and governments are most concerned is the serious organized crime dimension. That is real, and it's something. It's one of the dark underbellies of the end of the Cold War. The intelligence community really missed is what happened when these formerly totalitarian societies were the walls fell, and the sort of gray market economies that really held them together went global. And of course, the internet, especially in Central Eastern Europe, where there's a good skill set to exploit the internet and software for commercial advantage, has been a huge boon. And it's something that the global law enforcement system, Interpol, Europol, is not really equipped to deal with. They're getting better. Europol just appointed a new director of cybercrime, and they're starting to really ramp up units. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take a rewrite of a lot of laws and conventions to deal with that. But where a lot of the media is focused on the warfare end, of course, is what states may and may not be doing to one another. And I kind of come down on the side that most of that is within the realm broadly of espionage. And so if it's cyber attack to take down a critical piece of infrastructure, That's very dubious, and international lawyers will tell you when that crosses the war threshold. It's not so much a legal question, though. In this case, I've been told many times it's a political question. When does war take place? When the other guy says it does, and when they start attacking you back. And then cyber exploitation, to actually go in and surreptitiously take data exfiltration from systems. There have been examples of the U.S. prize of the Joint Strike Fighter that accused Chinese hackers of stealing that on the SIPRNet, the secure internet. So there's a range of stuff going on. I respectfully disagree a little bit that governments really are getting a handle on it. I think they are and they aren't. Something that we've seen on the university side in a continual complaint is that we can supply cyber warriors and cyber forensics and criminologists. That's easy. Supplying the people to manage them in government in industry is really, really difficult, and that takes a more well-rounded person that we really haven't started
there are no
to
cyber
supply.
bureaucrats as yet.
Not yet. They're coming.
Before we go out to the audience and Peter, who I can feel is urging for a fight over here,
No, not particularly.
there you are.
Thank you.
Claire, you talked earlier about the possibilities of adding values and norms to cyber warfare, and we've seen headlines earlier this week or a few days ago about the idea of like a Geneva Convention for cyber warfare. How are you going to get script kiddies to sign up to the Geneva Convention?
That's a very good question. I think the headlines referred also to Haig's speech in Munich, and I thought that was actually quite an interesting speech with regard to what he proposed, this idea of proportionality, rights, how do you encourage innovation but at the same time respect the basic freedoms that the internet provides. But what's interesting is there is actually no social contract with the internet. You know, we're so used to it in everyday life as something we just take for granted, but in the internet there's no sense of what is actually harm, at what point does it maybe go beyond what is acceptable behaviour, what do I consider is right and wrong, when are my rights being infringed, and because it is almost a bit of a free-for-all within the internet, we let much more pass, and I think it'd be interesting to start introducing debate about that. I don't think it can be achieved overnight. I think when you begin to talk with other international actors, it becomes incredibly more difficult because different countries view the internet and the rights it brings in different ways. But I think the fact that we are willing to begin to talk about it as a country is quite encouraging.
Final word before we go out to the audience. You, many years ago, when I were a lad, I remember reading things that you wrote about the hacker ethic and about the sort of that sort of way of thinking of pushing the boundaries on systems for intellectual curiosity or for prowess and so on. I'm just interested, where do you think that sort of thing ties in with this potential social contract for using the internet?
Okay, a bit of background. A long time ago, I wrote a book called The Hacker's Handbook under a pseudonym. I was rather fortunate in that shortly before it was published, a couple of guys were arrested for hacking into the Duke of Edinburgh's account on an old system called Prestel, which is the sort of publicity that you simply can't organise, but it went rather sort of wild, and what had started off as something that was a bit of amusement for me actually sort of changed my career. But having done the work, people then started to offer me various types of consultancy, and then I started to take the subject rather more seriously and became an academic in order to show that there was something reputable about me. The hacker ethic, I think, is something that really now relates to the time in which it was written, which was the early 1980s. If you want to follow the story in detail, it's not my book you look at, it's a book by Steve Levy called Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution, and he talks there about the growth of the people on the East Coast and later on in the West Coast who recognised that there were these interesting industrial process control chips which could be converted into personal computers, and they were the people who invented the personal computer. And the original idea of the hacker was nothing to do with illegality. It was basically, well, there was a little bit of illegality in that they were borrowing time and borrowing chips from their employers in order to make, as I said, what became the personal computer. And at the time I was writing the Hacker's Handbook, and this was many years before we had the Computer Misuse Act, then the way people like me saw it was exploring the network or the various networks as they then exist as a sort of a form of cross-country rambling. Now, I think that was a legitimate position to take in 1984 and 1985. On the whole, we did behave ourselves. The aim of the game was to educate yourself in how computers work. That was, it was a big curiosity. It wasn't about anything else. Later on, the word hacker became much more associated with criminality. Now then, does that ethic exist any longer? There are still people who are interested in pushing the boundaries. There is an annual conference called the Hackers Conference, which is devoted to that sort of thing. It's invitation only, and for public purposes it's actually got another name altogether, but it meets every year, and people of my sort of generation of computer nerds still go along to it. How relevant it is to most of the phenomena that we've been talking about this evening, I don't know. Most of the attacks that you're talking about are either designed deliberately to have a bad effect, or they are generated by what we call script kiddies, people who take the work of others and then adapt it for their own purposes, either for mischief or in order to make money, or national and international attacks of various sorts. The hacker ethic sort of exists. It's still interesting. It's probably, alas, becoming less and less relevant if we're trying to define the phenomena that has attracted so much press attention over the last couple of years.
A more elegant weapon from a gentler age. Let us find the microphone. Where is over there? We have a question down at the front, I'm afraid. Once again, if you can say who you are, don't make a speech, ask a question, and...
The hat for this is, I'm an executive of Survival International. We came under massive cyber attack a couple of months ago. But actually, the more you've been talking about individualism and muting this and fluffiness, the more anxious I've become, because you all sound as if you're trying to make it sound less dangerous. I mean, we live in a democratic society. The Chinese 2 or 3 years ago thought that they probably could never control the web. Now they think they probably can control it. They are not an individualistic society. They've gone into the Pentagon computers. It took a long time to locate that on an island off the coast. Warfare is about accumulating powers of destruction and then not using them until you need to use them. I would think from what you're saying that there are people accumulating these powers of destruction. When Survival was attacked, I mean, we're a tiny organization defending indigenous people. We had no defenses. The effect of it was to be totally blinded. To be blinded, we're rational, emotive beings. To be blinded is a serious thing, particularly if you've got nuclear weapons and whatever. I mean, is there not something more serious going on here? If you have a totalitarian society trying to accumulate this weaponry and they want total control over everything, is that possible?
Right.
Well, it sounds terrible what happened to your organization. It's something that happens on a large scale every day to NGOs, businesses, education. Every sector gets attacked, and I don't know if it's a denial of service attack or what you experienced. And how long did it go for?
It went up 2 or 3 weeks, and we put up defenses, and they came down again.
Okay.
Now we're spending a hell of a lot of money to
Sure.
probably from you. Maybe we're trying to get you.
Yeah, so it's good for
and we
business.
have calmed the waters, but I mean, I don't think there's safety in this, actually. And
Sure.
I heard the head of Microsoft at Chatham House not too long ago talking about all the monsters that you can invade computers. I mean, it seems to be limitless. I mean, and he actually said, we might even have to have a whole different web because this web will probably become indefensible. I mean, am I being exaggerating?
Well, yeah, Microsoft's had different views about its relationship there for many years, but in Wired quite a bit about that. And the essence of the issue is about governance in many ways, and of course we know the internet wasn't designed to what it does today. It was an experimental network that was really, really successful. And why? Because it wasn't engineered to do specific things, and that's one of its virtues, but it does have inherent weaknesses, and it probably doesn't scale to where it is right now. One of the founders of the internet, Dr. Vint Cerf, said even the UK now is challenged because it's a bit behind the curve in implementing IPv6, which has more security, but there's controversies with that. Service providers all handle attacks in different ways, so perhaps if you're the different provider, they would have had a different technique that they used and may have not cost you more money. You don't know. There aren't necessarily best practices outlined, and sometimes you learn the hard way. But I think it gets to the global governance aspect and what Secretary Haig proposed in Munich is to how do we create a governance system that prevents anarchy in cyberspace. And that goes back to the founding of international law and international governance as something that is one of the fundamental goals of preventing anarchy, promoting cooperation. And internet governance has been something that's been on the back burner, trying to address these things. I mean, Dr. Cerf and Kahn and other founding fathers have been committed to it. Problem is, the ministries that should have been on top of that, whether the Foreign Office here or the State Department in the US, and certainly the Ministry of Communications in China, it's interesting that they have one. Many other countries don't have such an entity. They saw the strategic implications of this. So governments are way behind the curve in having people that really get it and that can push proposals out that actually have some response.
Isn't one of the issues with the internet that the very thing that makes it useful, the very the very free communicative nature of the internet, is the thing that exposes you to these risks? But the mitigating, if you were to have an Internet 2 designed by Microsoft, which was very, very secure, it would actually lose its inherent internetiness. The ability to have security at that sort of fundamental level would mean that free communication that we stand for in this room, for example, would be itself mitigated. You know, the Egyptian internet is incredibly secure because they can turn it off.
It's one big switch.
Right. I mean,
in a pharaoh's office.
I mean, Claire, isn't there a awesome, really big switch? Hopefully, it plays music when you. Isn't that the tension here? That the more that you ask for government regulation, which has to be backed up by a technical solution, the more risky it is to then have a lack of freedom of speech on the net.
It is going to be a very interesting balancing point between those absolute liberties and freedoms that we've actually come to expect of the internet and the need for security. And I think WikiLeaks revealed that in a way, because you had what's the balance between the secrecy of the state and the rights of the citizens to know what the state is doing on its behalf.
Well, the way you put it, I mean, because people have recognised this problem for rather a long time, you know, you can either have a free, open internet with lots of scope for development, or you can have an internet which is very, very sort of controlled and circumscribed. And I mean, there's an initiative called the Internet Governance Forum, which is trying to get round that. Not sure how satisfactory it is. The view of a lot of the people involved in it is saying if you give all of this to governments, then you're going to have the traditional state apparatus putting as much control as possible and giving it to the traditional apparatus of the state. So there's no really easy answer to it. I think the question you raise is a really interesting one. Most of the time when one has sort of been thinking about cyber attacks, one has thought of attacks on nation states. But obviously there is the ability of nation states to attack individuals, and in particular NGOs which are unfriendly, or as they see it, and I think that's a real problem. One of the things we haven't actually been talking about too much, which I'd like to talk a little bit about, is what forms of defence are realistic. The military, who are increasingly trying to dominate this space, would have you believe that you can have a sort of a conventional deterrence approach, that you'll be able to deter attacks by saying, you attack us, we'll attack you back. That is, I think, a deep fallacy, because of what we call the problem of attribution. Most of the time you don't really know who is attacking you. You may have an idea which is sort of based not on technical evidence but on who is likely to be attacking us, and that's probably not enough for you to be able to mount any sort of a counterattack, whether you're going to do it in cyberspace or in more conventional space. One of the conclusions we came to in our OECD studies, there's got to be a much greater emphasis for everybody on resilience. You like this because obviously one of the things you're doing is offering an element of resilience, but the resilience has to come not only for having protective products that detect and stop the obvious malware. It's how systems are designed. It is the quality of software that we're putting in it. Isn't it extraordinary that people are prepared to buy an operating system from Microsoft in the sure knowledge that every week for the whole life of its of the particular product, once a week you're going to be getting an update, which isn't any sort of improvement. It is correcting flaws that were in the product that you bought in the first place. Why are we tolerating that, I ask myself? Because it's all those flaws which are giving the opportunity for the exploits, many of them, to be written. Other aspects of resilience are how you manage the systems as well. But the other element of resilience is what I hope is going to form part of a UK policy. I'm not sure whether that's actually going to happen, and that is having contingency plans. That you know you're going to be attacked, you know that your protective measures aren't going to work all of the time. What are you actually going to do in order to recover your position? Now, there are things you can do with a well-developed contingency planning sub-industry here in the UK, actually arising out of the experience of the IRA bonds. People do know how to do these things. There are all sorts of techniques which are available. It seems to me that in any sort of future UK cyber policy, I will be looking much more to that than to seeing the Ministry of Defence saying that they want lots of money for new gadgets which they want to spend with their friends at British Aerospace, and sorry to say this, Northrop Grumman, who are busy hanging around absolutely every aspect of this area trying to get products sold. And that's going to be, I think, a very interesting development.
I think as well, sorry, and as part of resilience, what's going to be quite key, and this links back to what you're saying, is that we're in a government now that believes very much in big society, small government, big society. It's going to be about sharing the responsibility for national risks, national threats, and I think there's going to be a huge part of it that's going to say, we cannot possibly know what is going on in every single industry, every single organisation and NGO, but what we can do is we can educate you. And I mean, I hope that will be what will happen, because that is going to be crucial to making sure that everyone is able on their own to do their bits to protect themselves and their organisation against the threat. And you can't do that if it's a one-way traffic. It has to be two-way, whereby people are saying, this is what we've been exposed to, what do you know that we don't, who's attacking us, what's the best equipment that we have, what's the best software. And I think that is going to be really key to achieve the resilience that Peter's discussed.
So we found out what the big society is for the first time. Behind us.
Right early on, you said that the myths of the internet were being perpetuated by journalists. So I got two questions.
Sorry, can you speak up a little?
Sorry, right early on, you said that there was mythology being perpetuated by journalists. And so with that in mind, could you just name them quickly so they're not perpetuated anymore? And second, final question is, so is the Matrix our future?
Well, let someone else take the second one. But
Well, let's have a myth each, and let's start.
I don't. The Matrix is an interesting one. I think a couple quick points on the previous discussion. I just want to bring up. User education does seem to be a significant thing. I don't think there are enough forums where businesses can get together and openly discuss what sort of attacks they've been under and how they're mitigating those, probably because people are just worried about discussing this. They don't want to admit that they've been attacked in any way. So one of the things we try to promote is to get these discussions underway so that people can feel as though they can discuss any attacks that have been underway. I just wanted to make that point based on the previous discussion. But I mean, one of the biggest sort of false things that the people I speak to always bring up is obviously it's not going to be me, it's going to be someone else who's attacked. and that's not necessarily the case anymore. 2 or 3 years ago, 4 years ago, you could bury your head in the sand, pretend that you wouldn't be attacked. You don't think you've got anything that's valuable to people with malicious or criminal intent. You create a small little network. You try and lock as many things down as possible, but the things the technologies that people want to embrace now have changed. So people and businesses are putting themselves in the firing line by utilising technologies, but they don't have any protection in place. They don't have any risk management systems in place. They don't have any disaster recovery systems in place. Their security guys aren't carrying around high-frequency radios to communicate with each other in case the phone systems go down. And people need to start thinking about these things rather than just thinking it's not going to happen to me.
Myth number one, myth number two.
Right. Myth is quite a long time ago. It was on the front page of the Sunday Times, and they were talking about something called a high energy radio frequency gun. The possibility of releasing a sudden burst of high energy, which is going to frazzle the insides of a computer. And the Sunday Times ran this story and said that it had actually been deployed in the City of London, and that large numbers or significant numbers of city institutions had paid blackmail in order to avoid any sort of repetition. I know the journalist who produced the story. He still seems to believe it, but it seemed to me to be total nonsense. I went to a closed police conference in which many of the targets were there, and not only did they absolutely deny it, but it also seemed to me that one could actually run quite a simple test on it. If you're going to be deploying a gun of that sort or a high energy radio frequency source in a place like the City of London, you would expect there would be some collateral damage. That in addition to knocking out the particular targets you were aiming at, you would probably be knocking out traffic lights and all sorts of smaller companies who weren't going to be playing up blackmail. So I asked myself, how is it that there was no evidence of this whatsoever? And it seems to me that is actually a model for testing quite a lot of these anecdotes that you frequently hear. Is the system that's supposed to have been attacked via the internet is actually connected to the internet? The fact that somebody has got into part of a operation doesn't mean to say they got into the whole of the operation. Probably read over the weekend stuff about people have got into NASDAQ. Well, as far as I can work out, they may have got into some NASDAQ subsystems. It didn't actually affect the main running of the NASDAQ stock exchange at all. And a degree of skepticism seems to me to be a very healthy one. I have a particular problem because having been sort of in this area for quite a long time, I'm on a lot of sort of contact lists, and what journalists tend to do is when they have a dodgy story, let's sort of find somebody, an expert who is going to stand it up, and there's something of a responsibility to try and do that properly. There's obviously my terrible ego and my desire to see myself in print on as many occasions as possible, but sometimes I'm able to restrain it when I think the story is total nonsense.
So a key plot point in Ocean's 11, I remember that. Now, Claire.
Myth. I think the idea of a cyber-mageddon, I think is what it's called, or a cyber holocaust, is slightly inflammatory language from the media.
Agreed.
And with regard to whether the Matrix is the future, I imagine you have to just follow the white rabbit or whichever it is to see whether or not, but I don't think so.
Rex, myth number 4.
So myth number 4, about a year and a half ago, fairly major publications reported that a substation in Sao Paulo was taken out by a denial of service attack on a SCADA controller. And just by the tagline, people should have had questions about that. And it took the Brazilian government about a year to actually confirm that this never happened. They couldn't find the official that discloses at the conference, but it got printed everywhere at the time, and it's still out there. So things like that, the verification, and journalists are challenged because they're not engineers necessarily when they report these things, but I don't know what the solution is and how you press officials more to confess whether these are true or not. And in the matrix, I'm trying to figure out what the blue pill and the red pill is. I guess open internet and total secure. And
while we're having a
what do we
dig at
follow?
journalists, one of the things I find is that people sometimes sort of shop around for the expert who's going to give them the colourful quote. Really sometimes acutely aware of having spoken to somebody and dismissed the story, but the story still appears and another expert's name is, well, they were prepared to commit themselves more than I was.
Couldn't possibly happen in this room. Just before we go back out to the audience, you made an interesting point about many of these critical national infrastructure things that people are worried about aren't actually connected to the internet. And there was some, I think a report came out over the weekend that the people at the Hoover Dam were particularly upset because the idea of a hacker opening the Hoover Dam and killing 200 million people was continually being put out by the Department of Homeland Security as this big risk. And the guy in charge of the IT system at the Hoover Dam said, yeah, but we're not actually connected to the internet. It's not liable to happen. And there are people in Congress who to this day are trying to get funding for their favorite thing based on the idea that the Hoover Dam could be, or Las Vegas could be turned off by some 13-year-old Chinese teenager or something. Is there not a sort of an inflationary thing that's happening here? Isn't it, in many, although there are some very, very important risks, and obviously lots of great effects that are happening in the world, isn't there also, the Strategic Defence Review, which came out last year, said that cyber warfare, cyber attack is going to be the next big thing. The Navy's been told it can't buy any more aircraft carriers. Is this not just another thing of some more shiny toys that the guys in green want to buy?
I think cyber is going to be a genuine issue that we're going to have to address, and I think it's encouraging that they're giving money to look at it. I think 650 million, I think it is, within the SDSR and NSS, is actually not a huge amount over 4 million, considering what is going to need to be done. It is genuine, but is it a shiny toy? People are certainly vying to get control of it and certainly looking to have ownership of it and see what they can do, but the pace of change within cyberspace is so quick that there is going to need to be serious investment to ensure that we're ahead of that curve. But we shouldn't underestimate as well that actually we are more ahead than maybe we think. There are far more defensive in place than maybe we realise. They may not always work, and we may need more because the successes in attack are the ones that got through. But
actually, what they said, it is cyber in general. It is not cyber warfare. They were talking about creating a safe environment for which people can operate. And one of the other things that I hope I'm not being unduly optimistic, what was called the Office of Cybersecurity when it was set up by the Labour government is now called the Office of Cybersecurity and Information Assurance. And that is code for saying, I hope, that they are more interested in thinking about sensible protective measures. And there's no doubt the MOD and the armaments companies are rushing around trying to get money, but some of us who have very slight influence in these matters are fighting jolly hard to make sure they don't get too much of it.
The office of backing up your stuff a lot isn't really as catchy, is it? We have a question here in the middle.
I'm very surprised that you haven't mentioned the actual cases of cyber attacks which brought down entire national systems. We've been talking for an hour and you haven't mentioned the attack on Estonia, which caused billions of dollars of damage, which stopped the national administration, hundreds of websites, the government websites, the military websites, everything, for a period. And also in the conflict between Georgia and Russia in August 2008, there were attempts, I don't know the extent of them, but there were certainly reports on both sides which actually affected the national communication systems, infrastructure, government administration, whole computer networks. So I really don't understand how you can be talking about this without action. And the military, of course, I mean, the UK Strategic Review, putting it in the top tier, along with only about 3 other things, including weapons of mass destruction and cataclysmic national disaster, does suggest that that they have some reason to do that because it's already taken place. So I'd like you to talk a little bit more practically And the other point is that the military, consider the Pentagon and the militaries around the world, are increasingly conducting warfare, actual warfare, by remote control, by electronics. And you've been talking, gaily about how security companies are attacked and their systems are. Of course, it's going to happen to the military on all sides. It's enormous. It's the biggest thing in the Pentagon. And the same is true of energy weapons. The Pentagon is putting an enormous amount of research into this kind of thing because it's the way to knock out entire cities and beyond. So perhaps you could address the question of what exactly the UK might do against an attack, because whether it's Russia, whether it's China, these are countries that have immense capability and they might have targets closer to us than Estonia.
Let's split that up into two things. So let's take the Estonian one first.
Right. Let me explain to you what happened in Estonia. I was in a conference with the Defence Minister of Estonia about 2 years ago and had an opportunity to talk to him at fairly significant detail. The interesting thing about Estonia is in the mid-1990s, once it had got free of Soviet hegemony, it launched itself on what it called Operation Tiger Leap. And it was looking partly across the Baltic to Finland, where there is some commonality of culture, and partly at Southeast Asia. And they were saying, in effect, we're a somewhat backward Eastern European country. We're now free. We're going to go headlong and take the very latest technology. And what they did was to commit themselves absolutely totally to an internet-type infrastructure. And that's what made them particularly vulnerable. Most of the analysis says that the attacks themselves were not terribly sophisticated, but they made themselves very, very vulnerable by doing that. The UK and most countries are not vulnerable in that sort of way because we've been using computers for a long time and because we have legacy systems which are not dependent on the internet. So one of the lessons you learn, most important lessons you learn from the internet, from the Estonian episode, is that you are really quite cautious about how much of your critical national infrastructure you put purely and simply on the internet without any sort of backup. I've been asked to confine myself to Estonia, so I'll shut up and let other people talk about the other things you raised.
A single point of failure is fair enough, but nevertheless, there are serious attempts out there to take over things, and as you said, there are increasingly, drones and artificial intelligent fighter jets that were launched last week, for example, and so on and so on. All of this modern warfare is occurring on these communication networks.
Absolutely.
This is a big problem, though.
Yes. I think there's definitely the military aspect. There are systems that can enable, I think it's enemy planes to appear as friendly on systems. There's intercept, you can stop communications. There's a huge amount of research going into this, and rightly so. I think the reason we don't talk about things like Estonia and Georgia is probably because I know myself and some of the others on the panel have tried recently to avoid referring to specific incidences. It's not that they're not in any way important or any way serious. It's that the debate has to move to a point at which we're able to look at the broader themes, at how you approach it from a strategy level, from a policy level, from a technological level. And I think with regard to your remarks about the SDSR as well, the SDSR was exactly that. It's a Strategic Defence and Security Review, which means that part of the responses are going to be security. And the idea is that that may not necessarily all be military. It's going to come from our agencies, it's going to come from our Home Office, it's going to come from Cabinet Office, and that will all require technology and innovation, and there's going to be a lot going on within those departments, and already is, but the military as a whole should not own this space. It has to be owned by many different partners, both government and private sector working together.
Rex, isn't that an interesting point, that actually cyberspace, or whatever you want to call it, digital communications is so ubiquitous, so far-reaching, so deeply embedded in everything that we do, whether it's commerce or military affairs or culture or everything, that to talk of cyber warfare or the cyber threat or something is like talking about the threat from the skies. It's something that's just universal, and maybe we're being slightly foolish and even talking about it as a thing, rather than just a collection of threats to different institutions and different parts of our lives?
Sure. Oh, I think that's a really good point, because as cyberspace and IT and everything digital, especially with the net generation, becomes normalized, I think especially the under 30, under 20 crowd looks at this in sort of disbelief, because for them to be denial serviced or taken out as part of everyday life. But the military aspect of it, which is getting a lot of attention, I think Estonia potentially falls into one of the myths. We know the team at the Pentagon who dealt with that. For them, it was an everyday incident. The people in IA that actually were tasked to over, because when Estonia, the president rang Brussels and NATO and EU, they had no response. The best thing that came out of it did force a crisis meeting in NATO to figure out how a military alliance might respond. They're still trying to figure that out. But sure, I mean, this stuff is being normalized and it is commanding a lot of attention. But a better direction may be to look at the positive side and what can be done to create more resilient platforms, whether they're private sector, public sector, or partnership. And there hasn't probably been enough attention in the policy community put on. There's discussions of Internet 2, there have been a long time. Those really haven't commanded a large amount of resources. They may be more going to defense companies and others that may have a more defensive approach to it. But resilience can be about building a better internet, having better design principles when systems are engineered, so security is done up front. So I think from the university side, we'd like to see a more positive conversation. I think the OECD report alludes to that. You can have better
to take up some of the other points you were raising, the Georgia thing. I mean, that was the example of a blended attack, but actually it had already been talking about it, that we thought that the future of cyber weaponry was to use it in association with conventional attacks, and that's basically exactly what happened. In terms of how the Pentagon is spending its money, the Pentagon has wasted huge amounts of money on things which have never come off, including the fantasy of having missiles which are going to knock out missiles coming from, having a defensive shield against missiles. The Pentagon seems to be a great sort of sucker for taking American taxpayers' money on very, very expensive projects. I can see you don't alter.
Deployed in Europe.
Sorry?
It's about to be deployed in Asia and Europe.
And does it actually work? I mean, that's the thing.
Hopefully won't find out.
Well, no, I mean, this is the problem. They spend lots of money on things which don't work. And the great worry, well, we're obviously not going to agree. It's quite exciting not having a bit of disagreement
We
here.
can take that to the bar later on. Let's go for another question over there.
Just a quick comment, really, more than a question. You were laughing earlier about the Hoover Dam, the idea that the Hoover Dam could be attacked virtually, but as far as I'm aware, the likelihood is that the Iranian uranium factory, at least the controlling computers, wouldn't have been connected to the internet, and that virus spread also by USB sticks, for example. So, something like the Hoover Dam could be attacked that way.
That's true. A lot of corporate offices now have super glue in the USB ports, don't they?
Yeah, sure. Companies are trying to lock down all avenues. It's just an attack vector. We know with stories of USB sticks being left in car parks for employees to pick up and oh great, a free USB stick, let's put it into the corporate network. It's just a different attack vector. It might be a targeted attack over email, it might be a website that someone connects to, it could be a USB stick, it could be a CD. Remember good old CDs, those big round things? So absolutely, it's just a different attack vector. Not every system has to be connected to the internet to have malicious software delivered onto it. Absolutely.
But the test, I think the overall test is the right one, which is when you're told an anecdote, you have to ask yourself, how exactly did it happen? What are the various steps and ingredients? If you're getting an account of that, or you think from your own knowledge you can put that together, then believe the anecdote. If there are sort of gaps, then you begin to disbelieve. And one of the other tests I have is when I start looking for lots and lots of different accounts of particular events. In theory, as you carry out more research, you ought to get a clearer idea of what's going on. Quite a lot of these things you find, actually the detail seems to get murkier and messier the more you probe, and at that point you begin to think, well, maybe it is less likely that the event took place.
We seem to be splitting into a sort of left brain, right brain thing. Let's see if we can find somebody from the right brain.
There's somebody right at the very back there.
Someone right at the very back, yes. And on Twitter, they're asking you to identify who you are. Feel free to use your hacker name.
Hi, I'm John Cartwright. I'm freelance. I was just thinking more about the freedom issue here. After 9/11, I think a lot of people found that the freedoms were curtailed, particularly over the other side of the Atlantic. And with the is the head of US Cybercom, is also director of the National Security Agency, and on this side of the pond we've got the GCHQ is in control of our Cyber Operations Centre. So I'm just wondering from that that perspective of could these sort of government controlled or government approaches to cybersecurity actually end up limiting our own freedoms by prying on us?
Claire?
As I said before, it will be a difficult balance. I think the things such as Anonymous, what they showed is that there will be calls for more freedom if people feel that they're being curtailed. So WikiLeaks, Anonymous, the general hackers episodes recently have showed that people will fight back if they feel they're being curtailed. I imagine we aren't always going to know to what extent our freedoms are curtailed, but I think given the amount of feeling there is both among this room and more broadly in society, it's going to be quite difficult to reach a point at which we are happy with too much information being restricted to us. I'm not sure to what extent it will go there, I'm afraid.
Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, said on stage, sat next to me a couple of weeks ago, that should we find that the internet, freedom of the internet curtailed, we should take to the streets. Calls for bloody revolution should he not be able to get onto Twitter, which I think is proportionate, frankly. Peter?
I don't think you were sort of suggesting a sort of a deliberate conspiracy. I think I want to knock that down. In other words, I don't think that people are sitting around Ian Lobben's table at GCHQ and saying, gosh, how can we curtail the freedoms of the internet? And one of the best ways in which we can do it is by elevating the security threat so that the public is prepared to accept certain restrictions. But I agree with you. I think that can sometimes be the effect. And all we're seeing basically is this sort of pendulum, which we've discussed already this evening. On the one hand, people want a safe internet, safe in every sort of way, and that tends to mean control, but people also want a free internet, and that means that there are going to be nasty things happening. One of the things we haven't talked about is actually, the old child protection thing, which is often floated as an argument. You get exactly the same sort of arguments going on in that domain as well. There is no easy answer to it. It is a pendulum and things swing back and forth. There's a particularly nasty event, people will put up with further restrictions, and after a bit they get pissed off with it. It's what we've seen with terrorism legislation. It's just, people will accept pretty severe restrictions immediately after a nasty terrorist event, and then after a period they say, well, maybe it's not a good idea to tell photographers that they can't photograph anything except their own navel.
But Carl, we know that's on a sort of national level, but many corporations, for example, are already going down that path, aren't they? Many corporations are blocking Facebook, they're blocking YouTube, they're blocking JavaScript, for example. They're actually restricting the internet within their networks, and certainly within government departments. Here in the UK, I know that there are many government departments who insist that they're very, very digitally active, and yet it's when you try and go onto YouTube, for example, within the Foreign Office, a big red hand appears on the screen and says, no, you can't be part of the 21st century.
You're a moron.
What do you see? How do you see that working with your clients? I mean, is there a backlash against that sort of restriction?
Right, so the people I generally speak to are decision makers, policy enforcers, who are trying to figure out how they can use all these 21st century technologies, but in a safe manner. There is a balance But if you wish to embrace these technologies, you shouldn't do it foolishly, saying, we know there's threats out there, but we're probably not going to be attacked or targeted or fall victim, so we'll do it anyway, and let's just look the other way while all our employees are doing all these cool things. That would be a foolish thing to do. So the people I speak with, these decision makers and policy enforcers, are coming to us and saying, okay, we know we need to use Facebook, we need to use LinkedIn, we need to have our employees happy and browsing to all these sports sites during their lunchtimes, but they need to do it in a safe manner. So long as the companies are also thinking about what technologies to use and what backup procedures they have, and what mitigation systems they have in place, and what their general security posture is, then you can do things that would otherwise be extremely risky, just because of the volume of threats that are out there, and the nature of threats now is completely different than it was 6 months or 12 months ago.
Fantastic.
But
I have a question for
I'll
Carl.
just chip in real quick. There's also contradiction in place. That some companies are saying that, yeah, we're going to allow some of our employees to use these new systems, new technologies, but for others we're going to lock it down, and vice versa. It seems to be that there isn't always a clear policy in place, just because there's so much confusion out there. People don't know what they need to be allowing. They don't know if there will be backlash if they stop YouTube. So they've just got to trial it. If there is backlash, they're like, okay, so we don't want to upset our employees, so let's do it anyway and hope nothing happens.
Rex, you had a...
Just a quick question for Carl. When your software is deployed, in your experience, do most employers notify their employees that they're being monitored in all cases?
So that's mixed.
Sure.
If there's a suitable security policy, and as part of that there is user education that we have the right to not lock down our networks but protect our networks, and if you wish to access certain sites, then it will be noted that you have gone to certain sites and you are allowed to go to certain sites for 1 hour during your lunch times. So some companies have these policies, others choose not to. So there's a bit of a mix, just because people don't know what they should be doing. If there's laws and legislations, then companies will enforce it. If there's not, then they're left to make their own decisions. So they try to reach a happy medium. And sometimes that's different across.
In certain countries,
sectors.
there are some loopholes out there.
Okay, let's go to our final few questions. The lady here who's been very patient.
Kinko Kobayashi, journalist. I'd like to have some advice in this age of cyber warfare to journalists, because do you think time has come that journalists should give up using the Google mail accounts and then Twitter and YouTube? Because journalists handle very valuable information, they may put their sources into the risky situation.
I'm not sure I heard the question.
I think so. The question, and I think we'll make this our final question because we came at the time, so I'm going to ask for some practical advice as well from everybody along here. The question was, should journalists still trust things like Gmail and Twitter and Facebook and so on, or should they be using different systems because the information that they might be transmitting will be extremely valuable? And this really harks back to, for example, Egypt, and also the sensitive sort of information that NGOs like Survival.
Sure. I mean, the answer is probably really country specific. There's no universal solution for that. I think in Japan you're probably totally safe, and many other Western orientated economies, probably not a great deal, although there's data retention acts and things that it could make it a sticky wicket if something were to happen, shield laws, and another interesting debate, which I'm sure you've had here. So I wouldn't recommend against using the big public email systems, but there are other steps you could take using certificates and encryption that might make it a bit safer. And I don't know if you're a news organization, I'm sure you have your own email system as well.
Threats to the journalist?
I imagine, as with anything, if it's in print, if it's on email, then there is a chance that it could get into the wrong hands. I think WikiLeaks proves that. I think we've only got through 2%, I think, of those leaks. So I think there's absolutely a need to be careful about what's there. But I think what journalists can do is absolutely expose some of the areas within this debate that are really interesting and that really need to be known to the public. There's this great medium that can then expose the nature of the threat, how it can be tackled, how the public should respond to it, and how private sector. So I think be careful and be aware that anything that goes online on Twitter and things like that could potentially be used. But I would also probably echo what Rex said, that there are obviously clear ways that you can protect yourself against that.
Peter.
I think if we're trying to come up with some general advice for everybody, that the key to it is a fairly sober assessment of what you think the threats actually are. And we've been talking a little bit about how you can sort of evaluate the anecdotes. Another thing one could have talked about how you evaluate the various statistics that are floating around. And really assessing the risks that you as an individual or your organisation, or if you work for a nation state, trying to do this in a sober fashion as possible is probably the best thing that you can do. There are all sorts of technical solutions that are available, including for the particular situation you're talking about, but it is trying to form a realistic view. And one of the things we tried to do in our OECD report was said, that the lurid way in which a lot of these things are being talked about, the sort of hyping up of various things, does not help you do that. So I've given you some simple advice: try and assess the risk. I've tried to give you some methods by which you can assess the risk. I do realise that in the end you're still left with a rather difficult task of looking at this massive information and then trying to relate it to, in a sober fashion, to your own particular situation.
Carl.
I think those are very good pieces of advice. I would also add, just for us all as individuals, I think that we have a responsibility to be security conscious. The actions that we perform, whether sending that piece of information over email, that is in essence plain text over the internet, your decision not to use encryption, your decision to turn Bluetooth on your phone, your decision to browse to websites without a suitable antivirus on your machine. These are things that we need to all just look at and then try and evaluate what are the risks of us doing this, but also what can I do to help myself. If we can start being security conscious as individuals and also pass on the word to our employers, to members of the public, that they also need to be thinking about some of the threats that are out there, but try and distill it down so there isn't that hype, as Peter said, then I think we'll all be in a stronger position because of the environment that we're in today.
That's a particularly fine place to finish it. Any other questions, you can grab the speakers because they won't be able to get to the door before you do. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank Rex Hughes, Claire York, Peter Summer, Carl Leonard, and all of you for coming. The video will be online from tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.